Hello and welcome to another episode of the Trimechanics podcast. This podcast is all going to be about training intensity and how you then how that affects your distribution in terms of training intensity throughout the year and the various other aspects of what kind of essentially whether age groupers particularly and people that are more time crunched and what they should be going for in terms of training intensity. So the reason this question came up is regards around polarised training, and this question tends to come up quite a lot. Simply because no one really fully understands or a lot of people don't really get what polarised training really is and how it actually does apply to the kind of the training intensity and what training intensities, let's say, an age grouper who's time pressed, what they should be training at. Because unfortunately, when it comes to this, I often like to see with any particular subject, whether there is a particular expert, there are groups that have done a certain level of research, and they've generally pulled everything together into a very good kind of review, and they've often looked at all the different aspects and they can give a good kind of summary. And often I always find that it stops the idea of kind of having your head turned by different opinions and different experts if you tend to follow one track who clearly have done a lot of work and a lot of research and have come up with logical responses and logical conclusions from that research and all the practical application of it too. The problem with training intensity and what works best is that there seems to be two camps. Now, you've got one side where you've got the kind of more threshold model or kind of pyramidal distribution, as it's called, and I'll go into that in a minute, but kind of more the threshold side of things, which is where the predominance of the work is taken, particularly when you're time pressed, is around the kind of tempo to threshold, around the kind of these areas such as sweet spot and these different intensities that lead up to and are centred around FTP. And then you've got the polarised argument, which is the interesting thing is that on both sides of that coin, you've got professors and researchers who have got a huge amount of experience that have looked over a lot of the literature. A lot of them have had practical applications. They both have worked in high-level sport with teams in different sports. The key thing being that one side has worked more on the cycling side and the other side, the more polarised side, has tended to work more towards things like cross-country skiing, just simply because that's who the researchers are and that's how that they were applying that practice. So that actually could have some implications, but it's often viewed as, well, cross-country skiing is probably the closest of that kind of sport to cycling and it is purely aerobic. There are some little nuances, though, that might make things a little different. So the reason, so polarised training is kind of characterised by this idea of that the majority of the training, about 80% plus, is relatively easy, nice, easy turnover, and focuses basically the idea really, and this is what people don't understand, is that you are staying away from the middle kind of lactate zone. So when your lactate roughly rises as you essentially increase your exercise intensity. Now, it's not lactic acid, it's not toxic, it is a sign that you are producing more energy from anaerobic metabolism. Now, your lactate can stay low if you've got more uptake of it relative to your production. So all these things have an impact, but the lactate that's then measured in your blood is a good sign of how you're going to start fatiguing. And things like FTP are heavily linked to lactate because simply at the point at which your lactate starts to spill over more and more of it is taken in that blood sample, then essentially you're showing signs that your muscle units are going to start fatiguing and all these other factors that then relate to essentially endurance. So it's a good marker. But what the idea of polarised is that you stay below 2 millimolar of lactate, and then when you do very hard training, you train above 4 millimolar of lactate. So 2 to 4 tends to be where there's that kick up in the curve of the lactate curve, and that tends to be where your threshold and FTP kind of lie. So you're kind of going into the tempo threshold zone very quickly through that 2 to 4, hitting FTP right towards the top of that, probably just underneath that 4, so that you are accumulating lactate, but you're not rapidly accumulating it so much that you're going to run out of energy or run out of that endurance very, very rapidly and fatigue. So that's a key principle to understand. A lot of people don't seem to get with polarised training that it's not going super, super, super easy or going super, super, super hard. You are just either way of that curve. And actually the key thing is that a lot of studies have been done on training right up towards that 2 millimolar of lactate, so when they actually can measure it, and that actually can be quite intense. Just as an example, you might have someone who has an FTP of 300 watts on the bike, and their 2 millimolar of lactate might be 250. So actually, it might only be 50, 60 watts, if that, below their, some people might be even closer because they're better at recycling that lactate. So actually, you don't need to be going at 0 miles an hour and putting out almost no power to be pootling along in and doing this kind of polarized model. And also, when you're working really hard, it isn't all out. In fact, it most definitely shouldn't be all out. It should be kind of just above that form and accumulating large amounts of lactate. So rather than doing 1 minute or 2 minute intervals, might not even really fall into that polarized training paradigm. In the studies, Stephen Seeler, who's done a lot of this work, has used in exercise in duration such as 8 minutes at that kind of above FTP, which is a long period of time. So actually, just because you're not completely going all out for a minute or two doesn't mean you're not doing that polarized model. Now, the key thing is that there's a mix of this between the intensity that is made most applicable for developing certain aspects of physiology, and there's essentially a mix with that is whether there's a psychological element in the fact that you have to do exercise intensities that are more related to your race side of things. Because if you do a lot of, or if you don't do a lot of any work anywhere near that race intensity, then maybe you're not going to be able to actually function at that intensity when you come to race. So the key thing is that there's nuance to this. There's lots of different elements. But the thing is that when it comes to physiological development, there is significant evidence that training, particularly when you have limited time, you should try and maximize your aerobic stimulus. So that puts you more into the threshold camp. But you've got to understand what you mean by maximizing the threshold stimulants. The problem is, with a lot of people when they do things like sweet spot, is they do it too hard. They think sweet spot is simply somewhere between 88 and 93 or 95% of FTP. And that's not necessarily the case. Sweet spot is roughly in that intensity for most people, but the idea is that you should be able to accomplish 40 to 60 minutes of it relatively comfortably and do the same again the next day. That is essentially its definition. It is the ability the sweet spot of having the greatest aerobic stimulus that you can continue to do over and over again to generate the largest stimulus. So in terms of training load. So let's say we were to look on over a week. If you were doing a training session and you did it so hard that you only did an hour, and the rest of the week you were doing very little, then you would only accumulate a very small amount of training volume at that aerobic stimulus. However, take the intensity down ever so slightly so that the stimulus isn't quite as great, but you are able to accomplish it every day, and it becomes a very different picture. And that's what people need to think more about. If they are wanting to develop their aerobic system, which is an important part of cycling, an important part of the sport, then they should be focusing on whether they can slowly and gradually increase the amount of aerobic volume they've got available. So if they've only got a few hours available, they need to essentially exercise at a relatively higher aerobic intensity. But the key thing is that when you fall over the other side of FTP, often things start going downhill very rapidly, and that's when you induce the type of fatigue that can sometimes take days to shift. So that's the key thing. The other thing about sweet spot is that just because if you're 5% below, then that can make all the difference. So 5% below those kind of almost those accumulating that state where you start to accumulate lactate can make all the difference, even if it might only be 10 watts or so. And that's where patience and discipline comes in, because you can push up to that threshold. You should be able to. If you can't, particularly for shorter intervals, then that threshold number may be wrong. So the key thing is that sweet spot for some people might be 80%. It might be 90 to 95 or even higher for some people because they're able to repeat that day in, day out. The other key thing I see a lot of people make a mistake of is that they will often if they keep on increasing the power all the time, not appreciating that one of the ideas of sweet spot is that you just stick at the same aerobic stimulus, possibly the same power, for a while, maybe weeks, maybe months, and see what happens. And what often happens is you are building a better kind of essentially middle base, in that you're building that aerobic base right there, so that you are then able to step on top of that. So I use things in a very different way. I subscribe to this idea of a kind of what's called pyramidal distribution, is that over the course of the year, the majority of the work, the base of the pyramid, is that relatively lower intensity work. And that is just moving a lot of time for most people, is that just doing relatively easier biking, swimming, running, focusing on skill and all those elements. And then you start to add on the extra layers. So you start to spend blocks at sweet spot, maybe over the course of 2 or 3 weeks, where you're working in that aerobic stimulus, and you're gradually getting stronger and stronger. And then ending that with periods of adding in long, harder, high-intensity work, so 4-minute intervals up to 8-minute intervals, that are really working on the top end of that aerobic system, but also the psychological ability of going very hard for a relatively long period of time. For most people, doing work that really high intensity, those really high kind of 2-3 minute intervals, doesn't really do doesn't really do that much good at a lot of times of the year, simply because that's the kind of work that can sharpen the axe. That's actually the kind of work that can really stimulate some of the essentially production of certain enzymes, but they're relatively short-lived. So it's very good for sharpening the axe ready for racing, but not actually very good for long-term aerobic stimulus. Because often it means that you then, the rest of the week, you don't actually get as good quality training in. But what I often find is that when people jump through into that polarised training, or that idea of doing that high-intensity stuff, they actually are not very good at doing the high-intensity intervals, because they haven't learnt to suffer a little bit on the longer sweet spot work. So when you've got that in the bag relatively recently, it becomes easier to do. So say you've done a 40-minute session, 40 minutes of sweet spot straight through at, let's say, 95%, and then you're being asked to do 6 to 8 minutes at what is 105 to 110%, which isn't a great, huge amount more. It's a significant amount more, but it's only for maybe 8 minutes. You can actually deal with that much better if you've been doing that work, that 40 minutes plus work at that middling intensity, because actually it helps you deal with that discomfort coming in, and you know how much shorter it is. So going from almost doing nothing to then doing very, very high intensity work often means you just don't actually get the most out of the high intensity work. But at the end of the day, it's all got to come back to the fact that actually what you're trying to do, what are you trying to train? You are trying to get better at putting out an effort over your race distance. And that's what it all comes down to. If you are doing longer distance racing, then you need to really focus on your aerobic ability and then not using as much of it. So you want to focus on having a big FTP, a big functional engine, a big lactate threshold, but then coming into the race, you only want to use a very small amount of it because you want to focus on your aerodynamics, you want to focus on all the other elements, and use very little of it, because at the end of the day, we are not getting off the bike like an hour in the hour record and just falling off. We are getting off and we are running, and we'll run to our potential when we are in that fine balance between using the right amount of energy, but also at the same time using the right kind of motor units and all that together, so that we're not fully fatigued, but we also don't feel fatigued, so that we feel like we actually want to start the run and actually run. Now that's obviously slightly different for shorter races, where you can go a little bit more all out, but in longer races, that's what's critical. It's holding yourself back enough to get the most out of your race, so that when you approach the finish line, that's you're giving everything you've got left in terms of your capacity for endurance. That might be nowhere near what your body's able to actually give, but at that time, it is all about what you can give in terms of that movement between you and your brain. So in terms of training intensity, I don't like people to overthink it too much, but I like to think about if they've only got, let's say, 4 to 5 hours a week to train on the bike, then those 4 to 5 hours should be at the greatest amount of aerobic stimulus that they can handle, but consecutive days, because they're going to be doing those 4 to 5 hours on consecutive days. So working around the tempo sweet spot is really, really beneficial. But then you can add in, when you've got to the point where that's not really making much difference, you can do an hour at sweet spot and it's relatively comfortable, then it might be worth then changing that up for a week or two and changing to do things like an 8-minute interval session, where you do 3 or 4 8-minute intervals almost as hard as you can go to add in that extra stimulus, taking a few days of relatively easy riding, and then you start again. you've got to remember that the polarised model was related to the distribution across the year. So a polarised model, even though a cyclist may follow the polarised distribution across the whole year and that the majority of their work is done in that low intensity, actually there's periods where they will be doing the threshold and tempo work. They'll be doing long, hard efforts and also they'll be training that into during races. At the end of the day, most races are at that tempo threshold intensity. So if you're racing, you are doing those efforts in as well. The other thing to remember is just not to forget what you did before. I often hear about certain professional athletes that when they move over to polarised training, and certain coaches talk about this as well, is they suddenly wax lyrical about how amazing it is because of certain results. And it's partly because they were more fresh, but also because they have taken the tempo and threshold work that's given them that aerobic, that high-end aerobic base. And that's the key thing. People don't, when we think about aerobic base, we're not talking about this long, easy stuff. That does build the general aerobic engine, but actually there's more to it than that. Actually, when you talk about aerobic metabolism, we are talking right up towards that FTP, even beyond, because we are still using oxygen and creating energy through the use of oxygen. So they often then jump into this polarised training and say, oh, it's fantastic, I shouldn't have done that threshold and tempo before. Well, they could only do the polarised training the way they have done it now, with long, hard intervals, because they did the tempo and threshold. But you've got to find the right balance for you. So if you are spending lots of time on the bike and you are not really feel like you're improving or feel like you're actually aerobically getting stronger compared to particularly maybe people around you, then it might be time to add in some sweet spot work to work on that aerobic engine. And then when you've done that, when you feel like you can accomplish an hour at sweet spot, you can get on the bike and then you can do an hour the next day and it's a relatively good intensity, then maybe think about whether you can then add in those 8-minute intervals as a separate block for maybe 2 weeks or so. And then because I often find that after 3 or 4 of those sessions, so I would do those 8-minute intervals maybe every 2 or 3 days, that hits a ceiling where they just cannot go any higher. You will go into the same session and improve. The 3rd and 4th session might improve, and then suddenly no watts are coming, no extra watts coming. You might even feel more fatigued. You might even struggle to finish the session. At that point, you then go into a little bit of a rest period. So you have a few days or maybe a week where you take things relatively easy, and then you either do nice, easy biking again, or you go back into accumulating the sweet spot threshold work again. And the critical thing is this isn't really rocket science. This is partly working with your physiology, working at the cell level, trying to accumulate stress, because that's what it's all about. It's all about accumulating a certain level of stress that you can just about deal with, that accumulates that stress and load, but then you allow your body to recover and repair. So you don't accumulate too much stress that you can't deal with it, and you don't then allow it not enough time to recover to be able to recover from that. So at the end of the day, try not to overthink it too much. And also, it's okay to gravitate a lot of these sessions towards the sessions that you like, because if it gets you on the bike and gets you doing them, that's probably the most positive thing. But you've got to track whether you are improving. You've got to track through sessions whether the power numbers are improving, whether you feel more comfortable at certain powers, whether the heart rate and perceived exertion and feelings are going down for certain power and certain efforts, or whether things are moving in the wrong direction. If they're moving in the wrong direction, then I would go for more rest and recovery, then start the process again and see what happens. But actually try not to overthink things too much and try and relate how much time you've got to essentially the training intensities that you use, bearing in mind that if you've only got a few hours, spending those few hours out on doing a very easy bike is probably a waste of time, because easy bike work and is essentially only really functional and when you're hitting 3 to 4 hours, simply because, and it's the beyond. So a lot of professional cyclists might ride for 6 or 7 hours, but they are in a good zone there because the first 3 to 4 hours was fatiguing them enough, or using up enough glycogen and using up enough of that cell energy. So the last couple of hours are creating that almost that fasted stimulus of we're not got enough energy. We have to upregulate all the genes involved in producing more mitochondria and all those effects. You can get those in a much shorter period of time if you use up that energy faster. And that's what it all comes down to create that cell signaling. That's when things like carbohydrate cycling come in, and that's when we really start thinking about those things as essentially adding on the extra bits of training about whether we can, and that's why when I've talked about using carb cycling and training with different levels of glycogen, that's why that can supersede time, because at the end of the day you could get the same benefit from just training loads, because you would end up towards the end of the sessions low on glycogen, or the subsequent session later on in the day low on glycogen, because you wouldn't be able to refuel fast enough. But you could also do the same thing by just going through that glycogen a little faster. So it's all within reason. So what I like people to do is to say experiment and see what kind of fits for them, see what gets them back on the bike. Also bearing in mind that time of day is important. This time of year, when it's dark in the evening, I think you're better off doing lower intensity work and very, very small amounts of higher intensity here and there because of the effect on sleeping. Doing long, hard, sweet spot work late into the evening at 7, 8, 9 o'clock isn't very good for your sleeping pattern and your recovery, and that's really important. Maybe saving those sessions for the weekend or times where you can get a bit more sleep in, get the session earlier on in the day is much better. So there's a kind of rough overview of training intensities. I tend to, as I say, you link your training intensities to how much time you have, the idea of you're trying to accumulate stress and volume without going overstressed. It's very nuanced and it's all related to the unique person. So feel free to ask any questions based on this, and then we can hopefully find some more essentially answers that are more related to the cases involved, and that might give a few more answers to other people in the same situation. Thank you very much, and goodbye.